My topic this morning is the birth of the Austrian School. And by the way, good morning to everyone. And what's interesting is that this is one of the few times in intellectual history in which we can identify the exact time and person that founded a school of thought. And that person I'll be talking about is Carl Menger. The Austrian schools, often there's a confusion that arises when people talk about the Austrian school because it's considered to have been founded during the Marginalist Revolution, which it was, and to be one of the three schools of thought that was simultaneously and independently founded on the basis of the law of marginal utility. But that understates how different the Austrian school is from the other two schools of thought that were based on the law of marginal utility. And the law, and we'll talk about this, the Marginalist Revolution was really the idea that satisfaction, consumer satisfaction from the consumption of a good plays a role in determining its price and its value. It's not just costs of production. So all three marginal revolutionaries, we may call them, Carl Menger from Austria, William Stanley Jevons from Great Britain, and Leon Walras, in the early 1870s, their books came out, and all three of them came up with some version of the law of marginal utility. But that's only a small part of Austrian economics, as we'll see. Let's take a look at the terms that were used. The Austrians used the term marginal utility. Menger did not coin that term, his student did. And again, utility is just satisfaction or the subjective value someone gets from consuming a good. Jevons used the term final utility, and Walras used the French term rarité. Now, all of these three terms did refer to satisfaction, but there was a bit of a difference. But before let's take a look at these people. I love to do this. Notice this is William Stanley Jevons, dashing ladies' man when he's young, but like a weird old guy who's feeding pigeons in a park when he gets older. Leon Walras, kind of mysterious and dark when he's young, but he's like your grandfather as he gets older. But Menger is hip and handsome when he's young and becomes very distinguished when he's older. And that's sort of carried over to the modern Austrian school. Yeah, I like that. So what were the differences between them? Very briefly. One, Jevons and Walras, the non-Austrians, considered cost and satisfaction or utility to be co-determinants and to mutually determine prices, okay? And secondly, they believed that utility or satisfaction was quantifiable, could be added up, you could subtract it, and you could compare it between different people, that there was interpersonal comparisons. Menger would have none of that, okay? For Menger, utility was simply a result of an individual's judgment about the importance of concrete goods in satisfying their wants, okay, and improving their well-being. So Menger was a lot different. He didn't see utility as something that was quantifiable or tangible in some sense. Well, what he saw it as was a ranking of things that were more or less important in to determining your welfare. So here, for example, you would rank, for Menger, you didn't add up utility, you ranked utilities. You ranked the satisfactions that you got from different goods. So if you had $2 and you were standing in front of a vending machine, for example, if you would use that $2, assuming all of those alternatives that I have listed are $2, absorb the $2, you would purchase the bottle of water because it is more important in your own judgment, your own subjective judgment, than the other two alternatives. And there are many more things you could do with that $2. So you're always trying to find the greatest utility in allocating your resources. So that was Menger's point, very important. But he discovered much more than the principle of marginal utility. Okay, his whole economics was based on subjective value and individual choice. He believed that it was really value was determined solely by subjective value, by utility, and costs really had nothing to do with it. In fact, costs themselves were determined by consumers' choices and values. So he was a creative genius, and he had a lot of influences. He didn't just come out of his system didn't come out of the blue. It was developed from some German economists, some French economists, some early Italian economists. But he was the one who put it together and showed that really economics, as we'll see, was the explanation of what the striving for human welfare entailed. Okay, the wants that were satisfied. Okay, that was at the base of his system. Now, let me just give you one quote. Menger was touted by everyone as the founder of the Austrian School. But let me give you Mises' quote on this. Mises said, "What is known as the Austrian School of Economics started in 1871 when Carl Menger published a slender volume under the title Principles of Economics. Until the end of the 70s, there was no Austrian School. There was only Carl Menger." And let me just say something about the term Austrian School. That was a term of derision, okay? That was a term that mocked the Austrian School as a backwater intellectual movement. And it was coined by the German economists who were historicists and were opposed to theory, okay? That is the theory that the Austrians claimed was universal and in time and in space, explained all the implications of all human action, no matter when or where they took place. And Schumpeter and Hayek also praised Menger as the founder of the Austrian School and as the creator or the creative genius that brought us a structure of economics that was completely integrated. So when Menger was starting out, the dominant school of thought was the classical school, and I just want to briefly mention some of their main doctrines. But these are the men who formed the classical school or who created the classical school: David Hume, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. And so for about 100 years, they really dominated economics. So did Menger want to overthrow them? No, he didn't want to overthrow them. He wanted to give them some of their principles a foundation in human choice and value. So what did the classical school tell us? Well, they had the great insight that prices are not random. They're not determined by tradition. They're not arbitrary. Business doesn't just simply set prices and tell consumers that's what you have to pay if you want this good. They believed and taught that the prices were determined by a universal law, and that's the law of supply and demand. And they knew that these prices were used by businessmen to calculate profits, losses, revenues, and costs, which permitted them then to allocate resources to the most efficient uses from the point of view of consumers. So if there were profits, businesses knew that consumers urgently demanded these goods, more urgently than other goods, and would move resources into those areas where there were high profits. So that was a calculation. It was based on their calculations using actual market prices. The classical school did understand this, and this is an important part of Austrian economics too. Where there were losses, it meant that these goods were using up resources that were more valuably used elsewhere, okay? Had a greater value elsewhere. And in the long run, that there was a tendency for profits and losses to disappear as entrepreneurs moved from those areas where there were losses and a lack of demand to those areas where demand was more urgent and there were profits. But there was a flaw in this great system of economics that the classical school built up, and it was this. They attempted to explain prices and exchange by referring to broad and abstract classes of goods. For example, bread, diamonds, milk, coal, iron, cotton, beef. Okay, so that caused a dilemma, or that caused a paradox for them. Human beings don't think of entire abstract classes of goods that bread is more important to me than diamonds, or diamonds are more important to me than bread. That's not the way they think. They think in terms of units of the good. There are concrete units of a good, and there are concrete wants for a good. We all have concrete wants for air, okay? But there's so much air, but the concrete units of air in this room, for example, the cubic feet of air that are in this room, is so great that it's superabundant. It more than exceeds our wants and needs for air. So for the Austrians, as we'll see in a moment, air has no value, okay? A cubic foot of air, okay? You can't say all air has no value. We don't think in those terms. But if we were to lose a cubic foot of air from this room, nobody's wants would be impaired. No one would have to reduce their well-being because there's less air in the room. So air, as essential as it is to sustaining human life for more than a few minutes, is a good that has no value from the Austrian point of view, which we'll talk about. So anyway, this confusion, this fundamental flaw in classical economics caused the classical school to get bogged down in what's called the paradox of value, and greatly affected the way that they explained how prices were determined. So what is the paradox of value? Well, it's sometimes called the water-diamond paradox. Diamonds have a very, very high exchange value. That is, they have a high price on the market. That's their exchange value. But they have a very low use value in everyday life, okay? They're used for ostentation, ornamentation, to show how rich, conspicuous consumption. You wear them around and flash them to show how rich you are, and so on, okay? So in some sense, they satisfy what some people may say are trivial human wants. But water, on the other hand, has a very low exchange value on the market, but yet it has a very high use value, okay? It's very useful to human beings. If you can't go without water for more than 3 days without dying of thirst. And therefore, it does serve very, very important wants. Some of the wants are more important than wants for diamonds. So how did the classical school deal with this paradox? Okay, so this is just an illustration of the water-diamond paradox. Notice that diamond, which was the fancy intense pink diamond, was sold at auction back in 2010 for $46 million. No one knows how much. Does anyone know how much that cost? No one knows what the cost of production of that diamond was, okay? So this is a problem for the classical school. They couldn't explain things like diamonds, whose cost of production were much lower. Somebody may have found that diamond on a beach, or got it for a few days mining, okay? Certainly it didn't cost anywhere near $46 million, yet it sold for that price. So that's why the classical school failed in some sense. So what was they had an out. They had sort of what they believe was a solution. They said, well, economics is not concerned with explaining use value. Okay, that's internal to the human being. We're not interested in that. We're interested in explaining prices, okay, or the exchange value of a good on the market. Therefore, they claim that diamonds are more expensive than water because diamonds are very expensive to mine. They have a high cost of production, okay? So it costs more money to produce a carat of diamonds than it does to produce a gallon of water. And since we put aside use value, consumer satisfaction from the water or the diamonds really don't come into it. It does in some broad sense that for a thing to have a price, the classical school understood that humans have to want it, okay? But again, they talked in broad classes, not in specific concrete wants. So they adopted a cost of production theory of value. And once you do that, your focus then becomes on the businessman or the business decision maker, the entrepreneur, the person who is trying to find resources at a low price, form them into goods, and sell them at a high price. So it was a theory of calculated action, but it didn't go back to human wants and choices. Okay. Now, the consumer then dropped out of the picture. Yes, the consumer wants these things, but the consumer does not in any way affect the value of these things. It's cost of production that determines the value. So classical economics became about the acquisition and accumulation of wealth by businessmen. And the satisfaction of consumer wants just dropped out. So even though, as I said, it was a very impressive structure of economic theory that the classical school developed, at its base, it was fundamentally flawed. Now, Menger, before he became an economist, and before he wrote his book in 1871, in the late 1860s, he was an economic journalist, and he watched markets. He watched commodities markets and stock markets, and he saw prices fluctuating wildly, much way out of proportion in some cases to their costs. So he thought about the classical school. And he said, well, their theory is not realistic. Okay, he wanted to know what the cause of prices and value were. So in his preface to his book, he wrote, "I have devoted special attention to the investigation of the causal connections between economic phenomena involving products and the corresponding agents of production, that is, the factors of production, the resources, not only for the purpose of establishing a price theory based on reality and placing all price phenomena together under one unified point of view." He wanted one price theory. He didn't want a different price theory for diamonds, which the classical school had, than they had for wheat or water. Okay, water and wheat had their value determined by cost of production. Diamonds had their value determined according to classical school because they were scarce and they were monopolized. The scarcity caused monopolization. So they didn't worry too much about that kind of side of the price theory. So Menger began what we call the causal-realist tradition in economics, which is the tradition that is central to the Austrian School of Economics. So Austrians see economic theory as a way of investigating what are the causes of prices, wage rates, interest rates that are paid on real markets, because that was what Menger was looking at. That was what he was trying to explain. Not what prices would be if we had equilibrium, that is, if there was little change in the economy, but in a real economy in which change is incessant, it's constant, and it occurs under uncertainty. So Menger wrote, before he wrote his book, he wrote out notes for himself. And he talked about what economics was all about in a way that was much different than the classical school did. So he wrote these notes to himself. First, he said, "Man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy." And that's going to mean something specific, and we'll get to that. He also said, "Our science is the theory of a human being's ability to deal with his wants." And finally, the very first sentence of his book is, "All things are subject to the law of cause and effect." Okay. So no talk of cost of production, no talk of a difference between subjective value and exchange value, or use value and exchange value. He did talk about those things, but showed that they were all integrated in his system of economics. Okay, so it was very important to him to talk about the causes of things. Okay, the causes of real economic phenomena, real economic facts that we see in everyday life. So he also wrote out in his notes a series of 3 connected concepts that are connected by causality. So human beings have ends. Okay, as we'll see in a moment. Let's say eating a ham sandwich and satisfying your hunger might be your end. So the end is the satisfaction of a want. Okay, now that causes individuals to look around for things that can be combined to satisfy that want. So the means are what are used, and they're called goods in economics. The goods or the means are used then to realize the end. So things go from the subjective, Mises called it a felt uneasiness, this defect in us that we're not completely satisfied because we're hungry, among other things, okay? And we look at our environment, in our objective environment, so we go from subjective to objective. We look in our environment, we look for means that will help us satisfy the ends, that is, realize the ends that we're aiming at. And he used that triad of concepts. And notice he went from ends to means to realization, and then the realization of the ends. He also wrote out man's wants, his very existence as an acting being causes him to look around the external world. Okay, that's the objective. You go from subjective to the objective, and then back to subjective again, in order to produce subsistence so that he can live in that world. Okay. And finally, wants, goods, and satisfaction. And he got this from the French liberal economist, 19th century economist, Frederick Bastiat, who had written this in a book, that it's man's wants that causes economic action, or the search to acquire goods, to produce them, to find them, and so on. And once you've found those goods, you consume them, and that satisfied your wants. So, not to belabor the point, but all action begins in the human mind, uses elements of the objective world, and ends in the human mind with the satisfaction of wants, or the realization of ends. And here's the subjective and objective elements of action. The guy's hungry, right? And he knows that these means can be combined into a ham sandwich, and that ham sandwich will satisfy his want, will eradicate his hunger. Okay, so the guy's hunger causes him to put together these various means, combine them. That's production. The combination of means into a consumable good is what we define as production in Austrian economics. And then the sandwich is made. And now the sandwich itself doesn't have value, as we'll see in Austrian economics. It's not the sandwich. It's the bite of the sandwich. It's the consumption of the sandwich that serves to satisfy the want. The sandwich only has value because people know that it will, or believe that it will serve their wants. Okay, that it will yield them services during the time of consumption, which will satisfy them. So that's very important. We'll see Menger completely understood this and showed that diamonds aren't expensive on the market, or don't have a high price on the market, because it's very, very costly to mine diamonds, but rather the other way around. The diamond mine has a high value because people desire or demand diamonds so urgently. Okay, so Menger came up with a theory of the good. That is, what is a good? Okay. The classical school just took it for granted that a good was something that people desired. But Menger said, in order to have something become a good, something in the real world out there, you need a human need. Okay, that'd be a human need, or a desire for satisfaction. You have to know that a thing is capable of being brought into causal connection with the satisfaction of the need. You have to know that the ham sandwich will satisfy the need. There has to be human knowledge. Actually, that's the third point, the human knowledge of the causal connection. And fourth, you have to have command of the thing sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. You have to have ownership or control. For example, if you're going to a baseball game or a picnic, you have a great need for a sunny day and no rain, okay? But a sunny day isn't a good because you can't control the sun, or at least we can't now. We can't control the weather, okay? Now, Mises pointed out that Menger made a mistake, okay? And one of the few mistakes Menger made in his book. And that is that 2 and 3 are wrong. You don't just need a human knowledge of a causal connection between a thing in the objective world and your wants or needs. All you need is a belief that a thing has a capacity to cause the satisfaction of a human need. Now, Menger, a few pages later, talked about imaginary goods that really didn't satisfy your needs, but you paid a price for. So he kind of recognized it. But Mises said that's no less a good. An imaginary good is no less a good than any other good. So if someone goes to a psychic to communicate with one of their deceased loved ones, that has a price, but it's nonsense. Someone reads the New York Times to get information about what's really going on in the world. I mean, that's an imaginary good. I mean, but yet, I mean, people pay a price for it. Okay. So what makes something an economic good? So Menger went a step further. An economic good is a good in which there is an insufficient amount of it to fulfill all human needs for it. So air in this room is a good in Menger's sense. Mises completely got rid of the term for air as a good, but in Menger's sense, it's a good, but it's not an economic good. There's more than enough for all of us. Now, air can become a good if you're deep sea diving, or if you're going into space, or if you have emphysema and it's a bad day in Los Angeles with the smog, okay, you will pay for air, okay? But otherwise, air, although it has a very, very high, in a classical sense, use value, okay, has no exchange value whatsoever. So that, as we'll see, is what Menger will solve that. So Menger talked about the economizing man. The classical economists talked about homo economicus, which was the economic man, the person who buys cheaply and sells at a higher price, okay? And that's the businessman. But Menger said, no, that's not the central figure in economics. The central figure in economics is the consumer, the economizing man, the person who will only use his or her resources to achieve the most valuable ends. Now, we're coming up to the law of marginal utility, as Menger conceived it, in a moment. So value and the law of marginal utility. So think of utility again in terms of satisfaction. And marginal means it's the least or next satisfaction, either the least satisfying use of a good that you have possession of, or the use of a good that you will use if you get one more unit of that good, okay? So marginal utility is a satisfaction from the least important or lowest ranked end served by the available supply of the good, okay? That's how Menger conceived it, and that's the correct way to conceive it. It's not a sum of something. So for example, I went to, I'm a big Beatles fan, and I saw Paul McCartney a number of years ago in concert, and I think I paid $150 for a ticket, and that was more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it was. So I then later on went to a Rod Stewart concert, and I paid $85 for the ticket, I think, or something like that. But if someone said, how much more did you like the Paul McCartney concert than the Rod Stewart concert? I couldn't say, well, I got 100 utils from Paul McCartney, but only 30 from Rod Stewart, okay? Because what the heck is a util, okay? They use that in mainstream textbooks, the term util, that you get certain quantities of satisfaction. But of course, a util has no existence in reality, and you can't define it internally either, okay? It doesn't have doesn't have any extension in time and space. We know what a pound is. We know what a foot is. We know what a column of mercury will tell us about the outside the temperature. Those are all things that you can measure, okay? But you can't measure utility. In fact, in the 1930s, the famous economist Lionel Robbins, who for a long while was a close follower of Mises, pointed out that utility is like love, right? You can say you could be dating 3 different women, and you can settle on one as your spouse, and you can say, I love woman A more than woman B, and woman B more than woman C, and so therefore I'm going to marry her, okay? Utilities, you can't say how much more you love one woman than another, okay? So it's actually true that it's completely internal. Okay. So the law of marginal utility tells us that as the quantity of a good that you possess increases, the value of each unit of that good will decrease because each additional unit is devoted to a lower and lower satisfaction, a lower ranked satisfaction. So Menger used Robinson Crusoe as an example. Let's say Robinson Crusoe was shipwrecked on an island, which he is. I mean, that's the fictional character, and has wheat, okay? How will he allocate this wheat? How will he use this wheat? Well, he'll rank the uses of the wheat. Let's say the first sack of wheat that he reaps will be just enough to make bread to sustain his life. And the second will be able to make him more vital, sustain his health, allow him to live and make choices. Whereas just the first one will just barely keep him alive. The third would be used for seed for next year, for next year's harvest. The fourth, he would want to vary his diet. So he would use it for feeding goats. Let's say there are wild goats on the island that he domesticates and gets milk and cheese and meat from them. Menger used whiskey as the fifth most important use. I like vodka, so I'll use vodka. And then if he only has 5 sacks of wheat. If he had a sixth, it would be devoted to an even less important want, and that would be to feed a parrot because he was so lonely on the island, and so on. He has many uses. Okay. So now the question becomes, what is the value of 1 sack of wheat? All 5 sacks are identical, right? They're all identical. They can all serve the same wants interchangeably. So how valuable is a sack of wheat? Is it the highest valued want? Is it equal to the satisfaction you get from sustaining your life, or is it equal to an average of all those wants? If you average them up and sort of try to figure out some kind of average satisfaction? No. He asked a very important question. He said, if let's say a pack of rats break in and devour one of the 5 sacks of wheat, let's say the third one, seed for the next harvest, which satisfaction will he lose? Let's assume he hasn't started using them yet. Always the lowest ranked satisfaction. So no matter what sack of wheat is lost, the marginal utility, the lowest satisfaction from that supply of wheat, is making vodka. Okay? That's his value scale, not mine. So that's the satisfaction that he would go without. So that is the value of every sack of wheat. Now, if once he's lost that sack of wheat, what happens to the marginal utility of wheat? It goes up, and the value of each unit of the supply of 4 sacks of wheat is raised. So the fewer you have of units of a good, the higher the value is. Okay, and I can give you a little quiz on this. Here's a farmer who has 3 horses and 2 cattle. Those animals are non-interchangeable. They're different They have different uses, and they can't be used in the other's use. Okay, so highest on his value scale, he has 3 horses, 2 cattle, is the first horse. Second highest is a second horse for hitching and making it easy, hitching to the plow and making it easier to produce wheat. Okay, the third horse, the third most important want is for milk, which is served by the first cow. The fourth most important want is for beef, which is served by the second cow. And the fifth is a horse for recreational riding. Remember, he has 5 different units, 3 horses, 2 cows. Okay. Which animal is more valuable to the farmer? Now, the way to answer this is to think about losing one. So if there's a barn that he keeps all 5 of them in, and it's on fire, and he can only save 4, which one will he not save? Let's assume he can only save 4. Which is the one? The horse. The horse is the least valuable animal. Even though a horse serves the 2 most important wants, its marginal utility is lower than the marginal utility of the cow. The marginal utility of the cow is a satisfaction from the 4th end. The marginal utility of the horse is a satisfaction from the 5th end. Okay? And that is how, we'll go back for a minute. That is how Carl Menger solved the diamond water paradox. If you're in a desert and you haven't had water for three days, and you have that intense, fancy pink diamond in your pocket, would you trade that for a gallon of water? Yes, you would, because the marginal utility of water is higher. It's the first end. That is to keep you alive for another 3 days. So you would make the trade. Now, why, though, are diamonds so much more expensive than water in a normal situation? Because water is so abundant that it serves very, very low valued end. Its marginal utility is very low compared to diamonds, which are much scarcer. Their marginal utility, the lowest ranked end that they serve for people, is much higher. So their value is higher, okay? And that's why air, which keeps us alive for more than 3 minutes, which we need to stay alive for more than 3 minutes, is only, has no value in a normal situation. It is valueless, okay? So Menger also wanted to explain, and he didn't do it fully, but he gave us an idea of how we explain the value and prices of resources and the factors of production like land, labor, and capital goods. And again, he used the concept of causality. So production runs from, he divided production to stages, okay? So in this case, the production of an automobile requires first that the iron ore be mined, second that it be transformed into steel, third that the steel is transformed into various shapes, fourth, so let's say each one takes a year or half a year, whatever it might be. Fourth is to stamp out the shapes for the automobile. Fifth is the assembly plant, and then the sixth is the automobile dealer, who displays it and sells it at retail. But these are all different stages. Now, Menger called the stages furthest from the consumer the higher stages of production, and the stages closest to the consumer the lower stages. And the consumption stage is called the final stage of production. So what happens is, in production, the cause goes from the highest stage to the lowest stage. Okay, so you produce the iron ore, and then you add labor, and you combine labor and iron ore in a factory, and that combination causes the production of steel, and so on until the assembly stage, bringing together workers and the parts for the automobile and an assembly line and a factory, that causes the production of the automobile, which in turn, when it's purchased by the consumer, causes the satisfaction of his wants for transportation, okay? So that's important. But now, the classical school realize this, but they said, well, if that production goes from the higher stages to the lower stages, so does value, right? So automobiles cost what they do because the steel costs what it does. The steel causes the value of the automobile, but that's not true. It's the exact opposite, as Menger pointed out. The value of the means is determined by the value of the ends that they serve, okay, as I mentioned before. So an automobile factory is extremely expensive, and the steel and all of those parts that go into the components that go into making the car are extremely expensive precisely because people value cars so much. If we lived in, I don't know if you've seen the old movie Witness with Harrison Ford, takes place in Amish country, and the Amish do not use automobiles, okay? They only use these horses and buggies to get around, okay? It's a religious thing, but if all Americans had the took on this value system of the Amish, would cars have any value? No matter how much it costs to produce cars, it would have no value. And therefore, an automobile plant would have no value. And workers specializing in producing automobiles, that particular skill would have no value on the market. So what Menger said is value is imputed backwards from consumer value judgments and the services of the consumer's good in satisfying wants to the consumer good itself. So from the services, from our wants and satisfying those wants, back to the consumer's good, all the way back up the stages of production to the highest stage. And Menger used tobacco as his example. He said, if there's no if people realize that smoking is bad for their health, then the value of cigarettes and pipes and so on would fall to zero. But so would the value of tobacco leaves, and beyond that, the value of land that could be used to grow tobacco. Unless it could be used for something else that people desired, it would fall to zero, okay? Same thing is true of diamond mines. If people rejected diamonds as ostentatious and trivial and something that was conspicuous consumption, then the value of a jeweler's services, the value of the diamond mine itself would all fall to zero. So production goes from the higher stages, this is the production of bread, to the lower stages. You can see the blue arrow going downward. But value goes backwards. It goes from the lower stages up, okay? The farm tools are only valuable because the wheat itself is valuable. But the wheat is only valuable because it causes the production of the flour, which in turn causes the bread and causes the satisfaction for consumers. So causality goes the opposite way when we're talking about value. And then let me just finish this because I have about 3 minutes left. So Menger ended his book with the analysis of exchange. And he showed that people will always exchange or only exchange when the good that they are getting has a higher value to them than the good they're giving up. So in this example, the first example, the horses and the cow, the horse is, in parentheses, is the good that the person does not have, but values more than the cow. So person A is willing to give up a cow to person B, whereas person B is willing to give up the horse to person A in exchange for the cow. Why? Because in each case, what they're getting has a higher value, a higher marginal utility than what they're giving up. And that holds for modern trade, holds for all trade, everywhere and at all times. Here we have a seller of a BMW willing to give up the BMW in exchange for $70,000, which the seller values more than the car that he's giving up. And then the buyer, she values the car more than the $70,000 that she's giving up, okay? And this analysis of exchange was radically different from anything that had come before it. The classical school thought that goods exchanged because they were of equal value. But the Austrian school, starting with Menger, pointed out that goods are exchanged because there's a double inequality of value. Each person values the goods in reverse order, okay? So I will stop there, and thank you very much for listening.